back, everyone, and welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. So I think hopefully this is a simple topic to address, although maybe not, because it's one of the ones that I get the most questions about, like almost all the time. I think people knew that there were test optional colleges before the pandemic, but it wasn't the majority, and suddenly it's the majority. And so there's a lot of myths out there. And just so everybody knows what we're talking about, I'll just restate it. Really the question is, should you report your test scores? Since, what is it? I think 75% of colleges are still test optional now. Should you report your test scores? When should you report them? And so let's kind of dig right into that, Ryan. What do you think? What are some of the myths out there that you've heard? And what do you think about this topic?
I think it's a simple topic with lots of different layers that have confused some people over the last few months and year or so. To your point, it was pretty rare for test optional in years past, and then now it's very common. And I think a lot of the conversations I've had with folks are they hear test optional and they think it's no longer important and it's not even part of the review process and for a lot of these schools. So they're hearing test optional and thinking test blind. Maybe that's not the words in their head, but they're thinking it's not a part of the review process. And I would say for a handful of schools out there, yes, they are absolutely test blind. And I think that's a different conversation. But for test optional, I still would and still am encouraging students to prepare to take an SAT or an ACT. There's a lot of benefits to having a test in your application at the right schools. It can be advantageous in the review process. It can help bring up some other parts that might be lower. But there's also a time when you might have a test and a school is test optional and you opt not to send the test for one reason or another. I've also worked with some students who have said, I'm not going to take the test, it's not important to me. And then I ask them what kind of schools they're interested in, and they'll indicate some schools, and they don't realize that some of those schools they're interested in require a test. So if you're scrambling last minute to take the test, is that really a recipe for being as successful as possible on whatever test you chose?
Yeah. Even last year, Florida wasn't test optional. I mean, which was kind of unbelievable given what was going on. I can be very critical. But anyway, yeah. So do not assume because the schools that you're applying to might require it. I'd say the only people who are pretty safe in not taking it are if you're just totally sure you're only applying to the Cal States and the UCs. And I usually recommend still taking it if you even have an inkling that you might apply to a school that isn't one of those. But if you're sure, and some people really are, like that's what they're going to do, they're going to apply to the UCs and the Cal States, then yeah, you don't need it actually.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
And I work with a lot of kids from California, and it has been extremely rare for me to speak to a student who says, I'm only applying to Cal States or UCs. That might be their goal, that one of those institutions might be top choice, but they're also thinking, there's a couple other schools out there that I'm pretty interested in, either privates in California or schools out of state. And that seems to be the majority of the California kids I work with. But to your point, if you're only applying to those two types of institutions, Cal States and UCs, then yes, this is a different conversation, but I feel like those students are fairly few and far between.
Yeah, I think they are pretty rare, at least of the ones that are interested enough that they're talking to us. Let's put it that way. So, all right. So now the question comes up, the student has taken the test, right? Or they've taken the SAT or the ACT, maybe they've taken both, but they've taken at least one. So how do they determine whether or not they should submit it? Some people seem to think you should always submit it. I talked to a family the other day who'd gotten some frankly terrible advice from another college counseling agency, which just goes to show that we don't all know what we're talking about, but we do here at Bright Horizons College Coach, but these people didn't. They said, if you don't submit your score, which is well below the school's average, they'll think that you did really badly. And my conversation with the dad was, well, they already, if you submit your score, they're also going to know that you didn't meet their average. So,
Yeah.
and he was like, oh my God, that's right. Why did I listen to them? So yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And there's, to that point, the school can, I guess, the college or university can speculate as to why you didn't submit the score, but they're not going to know exactly why. They're not going to know, maybe all of the testing locations near you have been canceled, or maybe you have a health issue where you don't feel comfortable sitting in an enclosed room for 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of reasons why students are not taking tests. And there's lots of reasons why students are not submitting some tests. What I hear frequently is, I have a good score, should I submit it? And I always push back a little bit, which, yes, there are obviously good scores out there, but it's much more, is it a good score for a particular institution that you're applying to? So it's a relative term.
Mm-hmm.
I encourage students to look at the admissions profile for a particular institution, where they'll break down the middle 50% for the SATs or ACTs for previous admitted students. And if you're in the middle to upper end, definitely the higher you are on that spectrum, the more likely you are to submit those test scores. And the lower end of that spectrum, then you're less likely to submit those test scores.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in the middle, I think there's some other questions to ask. Do you feel like these SAT or ACT scores are a good indicator of your ability? Or maybe you did great academically and you feel, for whatever reason, those SAT scores fell short for your expectations. Or maybe you didn't do as well as you had hoped academically, but your SAT scores are pretty strong and you'd like to have those be a louder voice in your application for you. So when you're in the middle, there are things to think about. But in its purest form, the higher you are at a university or college's admissions profile, the more likely I think you should consider submitting your test scores.
Mm-hmm. So how do they find out what the average scores are at the
Sure.
colleges and universities?
Yep. A lot of colleges and universities will have that admissions profile on their admissions website. Another good resource that I have found that information to be accurate and easily found is Big Future on the College Board. So when in doubt, I always go to the admissions profile, the admissions website for a school first to see if that information is there. It can be pretty hard to find at some schools, but Big Future is pretty easy to navigate and locate that information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing that I would throw in is that, like, keep in mind too, that different majors might have different requirements. So even if, like at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, I think this is a really classic example. I don't know if they still have it, but a couple years ago, I found a really good outline on their website. I love how transparent they try to be, where you saw the testing averages. And obviously engineering and computer science was so much higher than everything else because they're so well regarded in those fields. So just because your math score is high enough to get into arts and sciences doesn't mean it's high enough to get into computer science or engineering. So that is another piece, another wrinkle in all this. Right. So, and not everybody's going to be that transparent. I mean, NYU is another example that I like to give. If you want to get into arts and sciences, that's obviously going to be very different from their dance program. Right. Like, I don't think the dance program really cares that much about your SAT scores, but they're in the average. So, kind of drags it down a little bit compared to if you want to do business. Obviously, you really should probably be in the top 25% even is kind of where I recommend thinking about it. So, yeah, absolutely. Do your due diligence without a doubt. The other thing that I've heard, and I didn't find anything when I tried to look for it last night, so I'm curious what you think, is if some colleges still want to use it for scholarships.
So to your point, I'm getting a little mixed signals on that as well. I know that it was, the college may be test optional for admission, but if you want to be considered for scholarship, then you need to submit it. And that really varied by school to school. I have seen nothing comes to mind, like School X is definitely still doing that, but I have worked with some students who have indicated that they are sending their test scores because they want to be considered for a scholarship. So it's one more, to use your terminology, wrinkle in the college search and application process, is making sure that you're doing everything you need to do to be considered for admission and scholarships. whether that's submission of a test score or additional essays or other parts of the application that might be considered for scholarship consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news with that is that you're most likely to get a scholarship at a school where you are above average anyway. So probably your test scores are also going to be above average in that,
Yep.
So I think it'll work out. So that's kind of all the area that I can think of. Do you have any other wrinkles that you want to straighten out for us?
It's not definitely not wrinkles. It's more of the misconception that they're not required anymore. I've worked with a lot of families who are a little surprised when I still say prepare for and take an SAT or an ACT. They're equally weighed at each school that would review them. So I encourage taking a PSAT or a PACT to see if you prefer one over the other or do better on one over the other, and then devote your time and energy to preparing for that one, usually in your second semester junior year. But the pros, I feel, outweigh the cons of taking the SAT or ACT. I always tell students it's better to have too much information and not use it than not have enough and need it. Last week I worked with a student and I mentioned a school that they were interested in required SATs, and it was very surprising to them. They just were under the impression that this was no longer a part of the process. They're having to scramble a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do encourage it. I know it is one extra thing to add to an already full plate for a lot of students. But again, not to repeat myself, but I feel like the pros outweigh the cons.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Just so you know, do plan on taking it, and that way you have it in hand if you need it, because you really don't know if your school will require it or if it will help you for a scholarship. So unless you're sure you're going to do really terribly, like your PSATs have indicated that, in which case, yeah, maybe that's another reason not to bother. So,
right.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so we will be back shortly, and then Kira Tyler and I will be discussing the University of Chicago prompts.